very much. So yes, I'm Bonnie Robinson and working for the Salvation Army. I think I've worked for just about every denomination except for the Catholics, and I was at a meeting of the leaders of the mainline churches. You may not know, but the leaders of the mainline churches every year meet with the Prime Minister, and they bring advisors. So I was one of the advisors, and I said that in the pre-meeting with the leaders, and the Catholic bishop went, "There's time." So, we're very ecumenical here. So yeah, I'm going to talk for a little bit. There's quite a lot to get through, but hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions in discussion. I may not be able to answer all of your questions, as I'm not an economist, but will answer as many as I can. So I just at this point like to acknowledge that I did not write the State of the Nation. I have, as I like to say, I have people that do that for me. So two of our analysts, Paul Barber and Anna Ika, write the State of the Nation. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we do that in a minute. So first of all, just for those who don't know what the Salvation Army does, now one of the reasons we're branded is it's a requirement if you're speaking publicly or meeting politicians or on the media that you wear brand wear, as it's now called. It's not called uniform anymore, it's called brand wear. The Salvation Army brand is one of the most recognised in the world. It's almost next to McDonald's. No, there's been research, it's true. People recognise it wherever you go. The Salvation Army is a big organisation. It does a lot. I won't go through it all. Just one thing I want to point out, a couple of things to point out though. This van here with Good Shop on it, which is next to our financial mentoring, this is just an example of the kind of thing the Salvation Army tries to do. You will probably all remember that there used to be these vans going around, particularly poor communities, selling goods on credit. And they were absolutely appalling. The credit terms were usurious, the goods were poor quality, and they deliberately targeted communities where people often couldn't drive, couldn't get out easily to other shops, and people who had English as a second language and didn't understand contracts. And a lot of those people would end up in tremendous debt, and they'd end up at our financial mentors, which is what we call budget advice now. And so the Salvation Army decided they needed to get rid of these trucks from the poor communities. So they started their own trucks, which were loaded with second-hand goods from the family stores that were sold at, reasonable prices, and they actually have managed to drive many of the other trucks out of these areas because people in these communities were suddenly had an option, and also were educated as part of that that they shouldn't do business. So it's one of the things I like about the Sallies is they don't just go, oh, there's all these people in debt coming. They go, what can we do to actually shift that dial? And the Hauora service, so that the medical service is a similar one. That's only been going about 18 months. Salvation Army provides a lot of social housing and transitional housing, and they were discovering as they were moving people into some of their new housing that people didn't have a GP because they couldn't afford a GP, and so they didn't enrol for a GP. They would just, if they went to the doctor at all, they'd be a walk-in or go to an emergency clinic. And so they've started the service. It's in Royal Oak, and it is a nurse practitioner-led service, but it does have GPs as well. And for most people who turn up, it will be 100% free. They don't charge on top of what they get from the government. Which means that the Salvation Army currently is subsidising that service by $500,000 a year and looking to how we make that viable. But it means that for many people in our housing, for the first time in their lives, they have consistent general practitioner type care. And a lot of people in our housing have mental health in an addictions past and disability and all sorts of medical issues that do require consistent care. So that's the kind of thing the Salvation Army likes to do. is to go, here's a problem presenting itself, how do we actually fix that? And the other thing I think that is reasonably distinctive, for the Salvation Army, theologically, they have never separated what you might call faith, spirituality from social service. They can't even conceive of that. It is completely integrated for them. So that means that if I was a minister in the Salvation Army, I could be doing anything from running a church and preaching on Sunday to running an addiction program. They see it all as one and the same, which actually I'm finding really rather refreshing. So, as you'll know, potentially, that Salvation Army was founded in the United Kingdom in the 1800s by the Booths, William and Catherine Booth, and they were both equally involved, which again was also unusual. They were very much ahead of their time in many ways, particularly in that they always had an understanding that the suffering they were seeing amongst poor people was not because of their individual choices alone. It was because of structural things that were happening in society and the economy at the time. In early industrialised Britain, what the Booths saw was gruelling work conditions and hours for the poor, a lack of a social safety net, a lack of access to clean drinking water and good food, child labour, overcrowded housing, and a justice system that punished the poor for being poor. We don't have all of those issues today, but sadly we do have some, and we've got a few more of our own, which is why every year the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit, which is what I lead, amongst other things, produces the State of the Nation report. So if you will hear a lot in the media all the time about GDP and CPI and the interest rate and all those kinds of things. We hear the social statistics a lot less frequently. We might hear about social issues, but we don't get the social statistics in the media that often. So the State of the Nation was devised as a way of bringing those social statistics out into the public and making them available. It's been going now for 18 years. We've been producing the State of the Nation for 18 years. So it's kind of become a time series as well, where we can look back and see what has changed, what's got better, what's got worse, what's stayed the same. Everything in the report, all the stats in the report, apart from a couple, are publicly available. They're actually government stats. So if you want to go and check whether we got it right, you can go to the source documents. But one of the issues is even though all that's publicly available, most people don't have time or the ability or the inclination to go and find it all because it's spread across multiple government departments. So again, one of the purposes of State of the Nation is to bring all those stats together into a document that is easy for people to use who aren't policy and data nerds but would actually just like to find out a little bit. So that's why we do it. It's not a solutions document, so if you're looking for the solutions to all these problems tonight, we can have a bit of a chat about those, but in this document we're really just describing what the stats are saying about the social situation. And some of the other work we do, we try to have a look at some of the solutions. So having said that, I'll head into talking what the report says. So child poverty. If you were listening to the government budget this year, you might have heard an acknowledgement from Nicola Willis that they were not going to meet the child poverty reduction targets this year. They're not going to get even anywhere close. And just to be clear, the child poverty reduction targets are just about making a dent in child poverty. They're in no way about eliminating it, but we're not even going to make that dent this year. So child poverty is a really good indicator about levels of poverty generally, because households with children are much more likely to experience poverty than others. However, single people, particularly single men, and some older people are also found in the poverty statistics and are disproportionate to their population size, but it's mainly families with children. And so you can see from this graph that we were doing quite well a decade or so ago, but that's starting to creep back up again. The little dent in around 2019, 2020, just before COVID, was actually due to some quite good changes in government policy that were starting to make a dent. But then COVID and the economic situation and some changes in government policy, that's moving up again. So thousands more children were in material hardship in the year to June 2024 than the previous year. And at the moment, 1 in 4 children, so that's 1 in 4, face food insecurity, and about 230,000 children live in households where they're dependent on welfare support. And it's worse for our Māori and Pasifika tamariki, with 24% of Māori and 28% of Pacific children living in material hardship. And material...
What's the numbers on the left screen? What are those numbers?
I think that's in in hundreds of thousands, so 30 hundreds of thousands. Yeah. And we can see why we've got so many children living in poverty. So when we look at surveys of income adequacy, so this is households who say that their income is not enough to meet everyday needs, and that's about 10%, and those who say it's just enough to meet everyday needs, so that's 27% who say that. So given these are 2024 numbers, and given the cost of living issues, we'd expect these numbers to grow when we get the 2025 numbers. If we look at material hardship by ethnicity, it's pretty stark, where the vast difference between Māori and Pacific peoples and other ethnicities. So Māori and Pacific children particularly are particularly hard hit. And the number of children in material hardship in 2023 was actually higher than it was in 2019 when they first started gathering this. And so those little gains we saw earlier have pretty much been swept away, particularly for Māori and Pasifika. We don't have the disability figure here, but children with disabilities are also predominantly living in poverty and material hardship.
Bonnie, I feel I should know, but I don't.
Mila. That's basically anything other than Asian, Pacific, Māori or European. So if you're African or that, yeah, it's called Mila. Yeah. There's 2 areas of the data where you really see the impact of poverty. And just before I talk about, I'll talk about that in a minute. So, and those 2 areas are food security and housing, which we'll get onto. Food insecurity increased again last year, with 1/4 of all households with children going without food sometimes or often. But more than half of Pacific families reported that they went without food sometimes or often. And so that's 1 in 4 children overall, and 1 in 2 Pacific children are living in households where they go hungry sometimes. So I just feel as a nation we should be incredibly ashamed. We should be incredibly ashamed of this. We are a net exporter of food, and we can't feed our own children. And for Pacific children, it's half of them going hungry. So, I'm always amazed there isn't more outrage, to be honest, because I would think that it is a fundamental role of any government, of any political persuasion, that you have to make sure that your people are fed, first and foremost. And we're not doing that. There will be children going to bed hungry tonight, or there will be children going to bed not sure if they'll get to eat tomorrow morning. I don't know how many of you have seen the documentary called Prime Minister about Jacinda Ardern. one of the most striking things for me in that was she said that one of the things she had to think about during COVID and lockdowns and shutting schools was that she knew for a big bunch of children, school was the only place that guaranteed that they would be warm, they would be fed, and that they would be safe. And that she would be taking that away from children by having lockdowns. So this is one of our own stats. We report every year on our food parcel distribution. We have about 60 food banks or food distribution places across the country. We are one of the biggest providers of food to people who can't afford it. Although it shows a decline, obviously 2020, COVID, everything went through the roof. Although it does show a decline between 23 and 24, in fact, it's still higher than it was pre-COVID. And it's about 40% higher. So that, I always like to make that real. So that means that for every 10 families we saw before COVID, we're seeing them and another 4 now. So it just hasn't dropped back to even pre-COVID levels, and pre-COVID levels weren't great. So food insecurity isn't actually declining, even though that graph's going down. What's actually happened is we can't keep up with demand. There's too much demand, we don't have enough food. So my office is based in Manukau, which is where one of our largest food banks is. They've had to go to an appointment system to manage the demand, because demand was outstripping the food. And so people can make an appointment on Facebook, and the minute the appointments go up, they're completely full for that day. We do allow a few walk-ins, and they will get enough food for the day, but to get food for the week, people have to make an appointment. The Salvation Army doesn't see food banks as a long-term proposition. We don't want to be having to give out food. And we do have a strategy, Te Kai Makona, where we're looking at other options for people to be able to feed themselves. We've recently launched with others a thing called Community Grocer, where anyone actually, can buy products online cheaper than at the supermarket, and we're selling things like a box that will feed 2 people of fruit and veggies for like $15, just trying to create other ways for people to affordably feed themselves. But one of the issues we're facing is at the same time as we've got increased or not decreasing food insecurity, it's actually the government has tightened up on other welfare support. So both the number and the amount of money given in food grants by MSD has reduced and tightened up across the country. So apart from the immediate suffering that not having enough food causes, what we do know that particularly for our children and our young people, living in poverty, living in material hardship, living in an insecure food situation for any length of time can have a lasting impact, even if later on in life that child gets out of that situation. The fact that they lived in that situation of poverty, food insecurity while they were young can have permanent impacts on their physical, mental health and their prospects for the future. It also makes it really difficult for adults to deal with any other issues in their life. At Manukau, they have been trialling a program which we're kind of calling Food First, with a group of women who were very regular users of the food bank, and to see if they took for a period of time the issue of food away from them, what else could these women do with their lives. I think the thing that was significant for me was reading their intake forms, and for all of them, food completely dominated their lives, their thinking. Everything was about food. That was every waking moment was about where they were going to get food, would they have enough food, what were they going to do about food. They were usually hungry themselves because if they had food, they gave it to their children. And so they were often very tired, listless. They couldn't think about anything else in their life at all because they didn't have enough food. When that was taken away by us guaranteeing food for a certain period of time, many of them were able to deal with things in their life. They were able to get their driver's licence. People were able to reconnect with whānau. People were able to deal with difficult relationship issues. And some of them even started thinking about could they get employment and make their life better. But without that food, it's impossible for them to do that. If I can turn my pages. So this is number of households in transitional housing and emergency housing. So emergency housing's been in the news a bit lately, and it's been in the news off and on for a while. So when this government came in, they did do a good thing in terms of saying this whole issue of people being in motels and what was going on in motels for emergency housing that had happened during COVID isn't good. We need to get people out of emergency housing, particularly in motels, and into either transitional or permanent housing. And so credit where credit's due, they did do that. But the difficulty is that for a percentage of the people who were moved out of emergency housing, we don't actually know where they went, and government doesn't know where they went. So we hope that they've actually gone into good housing, but given the stats that we've got about homelessness rising at the moment, we think some of them either didn't get into stable housing or it hasn't worked and they've fallen into homelessness again. The high cost of renting is part of our problem with homelessness in New Zealand. 1 in 5 households in private rental are paying 50% or more of their income on rent. And what the research shows is that at 40%, if you're paying 40% of your income either on rent or mortgage payments, you're basically in an unaffordable housing situation. So we've got 1 in 5 paying more than that at 50%. So it basically means they don't have enough money left to pay for everything else. And most of these households are one crisis away from being unable to pay their rent or unable to afford food or whatever. And a crisis is like a warrant of fitness is due, or there's an unexpected school expense, or someone needs to go to the doctor because they're paying so much of their income on rent. And at the same time as we've got this unaffordable rent, the gateway to emergency housing has been tightened. So people were moved out of emergency housing, and then the ability to access that has been significantly tightened by the government, which means that if you haven't managed to get into permanent housing, it's now a lot harder for you to get emergency housing. So the Salvation Army has been hearing for the last probably about 8 months from Frontline that there's more homelessness. Some of that homelessness is the stuff that makes the headlines, which is people sleeping on the streets. But a lot of it is also people in unstable, overcrowded, temporary kind of housing that they're continually being moved on from. So we decided we needed to try and quantify or find out what was going on. But homelessness is really hard to measure. Government doesn't have a measure of it either, because it's very hard to find homeless people. And people sleeping on the street are actually the easiest people to find. Finding the people who aren't actually housed but aren't sleeping on the street is incredibly difficult. So we've done a bit of a survey and we found that homelessness is increasing across every region. There's no area that was surveyed where it wasn't increasing. Access to emergency housing, as I said, more difficult, and there's been a noticeable increase in people being turned down by MSD for emergency housing because they have contributed to their own homelessness. Often when an advocate goes back with the person, they access it, but they're turned down initially. Provincial and small towns are also really noticing a significant rise in the number of homeless people. And part of the issue is there's a lack of access to wraparound support because a lot of people who are homeless do have complex lives. They've got mental health issues, they've got addiction issues, they've got health issues, and they need wraparound support, and there just isn't enough of that to go round. We then did some more work with other agencies and came up with this data. And some of this comes out of OIAs to government, so getting some data out of government that isn't public. So we kind of estimate that 1 in every 1,000 people in New Zealand is currently without shelter. 57,000 women are homeless and in unsafe living situations. 14 in every 1,000 people live in housing that's not considered habitable. And housing, this was really interesting, housing is now the second most pressing concern for young adults aged 18 to 34. And reported crimes against people who are homeless have increased by 81%. So we've got a lot of noise from retailers, and I do understand their issue about concerned about crime and homeless people on the street. But in fact, the homeless are more likely to be a victim of crime than to be the person who does a crime. So why is this all happening? Well, we just don't have enough houses. So you can see here, this is social housing, either provided by Kāinga Ora or by community housing providers. And even though it's gone up, we just haven't built enough. So the increase 2023-24 is really, the Labor government put a lot of resource into increasing the number of KO houses. But housing is not something that, you put the money in and it's there tomorrow. It actually takes quite a while from the commitment of funds to the housing actually arriving. So we have increased, but it isn't enough. And now we're in this situation. So the number of public houses under construction now is a third of what it was 18 months ago. So we've got this rising homelessness, but we're actually slowing down on building public housing. There is no magic bullet in social services because people's lives are complex. But if there was a magic bullet, it would look like a house. Because without housing, you can't do anything. So if people have got complex lives, some of which is their own fault, some of which is not, they can't start to deal with that, a bit like food. Unless they've got housing and unless they have secure food, they can't deal with these other issues. And as I was saying with food, the very fact of not being in stable, affordable, safe, warm, dry housing then creates problems. So you get families who are ordinarily families that function well, good relationships, love their children. They fall into homelessness or unstable housing, and those relationships fall apart because it's so stressful to not be safely and adequately housed. And just generally, we're not building enough houses for anybody. So as you can see, it's all trending down. Even retirement village units, which it feels like there's lots of them being built, but actually that's slowing down. So we're just not building enough houses in New Zealand. We estimated that the shortfall for this year is probably somewhere, looking at immigration stats and all sorts of other things, is probably we need another 4,000 houses to be built on top of what's already been consented. And Kāinga Ora last year built 4,700 homes, about 12% of all the new houses. So with that previous graph with them, government saying they don't want KO to be building houses anymore, we're really concerned about, where these graphs are going to be by the end of next year or the year after. Okay, children and youth. Child poverty, as we said, got worse. Children at risk has got worse. Children in violence has got worse. Youth offending's got better, and we'll talk about that because that's not what you hear in the media. Early childhood education. This is our little bright spark of good news. We've got more people going into early childhood education. Educational achievements got worse. Teenage pregnancy has got worse. Youth mental health, no real change. So we won't cover all of those things, or we'll be here all night. And this chart's got quite a few lines, but focus on the sort of dark blue one, which is the line that sort of addresses the government targets driving their social policy, which is reducing serious and persistent youth offending. And this is following the 1,000 or so children and youth who've committed 3 or 4 more serious offences in 12 months, like burglary, robbery, extortion, theft. So we've been reporting on this data for a long time, and the dark blue line has been on a downward trend since 2013. During the COVID lockdowns, obviously a real dip because people couldn't go out and offend, and then a bit of a rise, but it's still on a downward trend. And it's actually 50% lower than a decade ago. And so this is counterintuitive because if you listen to the news, you'd think youth offending was rampant. It's actually not. It's been trending down for years. And in fact, there are far more children who are victims of crime than there are children and young people that commit crime. So substantiations of abuse and neglect have been increasing in the last year, and to about 11,000 children. Increasing number of children who are victims of assault. At 9,000 children in 2024 were victims of assault, and children's hospitalised as a result of assault, abuse or neglect. Highest number in a decade at 350. So again, while there's been a lot of media coverage of youth offending, and my son's a junior criminal prosecutor who works in the youth court, so there is a problem with a small core of young people doing offending, but a child and a young person is far more likely to be a victim of crime than they are to perpetrate a crime, which is something to keep in mind when we hear the messages about what should be done about youth and crime. So moving on to education, we do have worrying trends, and this has been in the media as well, in terms of educational achievement, which is taking a real dive. So this is all school leavers who leave with university entrance, and we can see that is on a really concerning downward trend. And there are similar trends for students leaving with absolutely no qualifications, and ethnic disparities are pretty significant here. Māori, Pacific students, and also those who come from low socioeconomic areas and who face other barriers are most affected by this downward trend in education. Just this isn't in our report, but just for Auckland, I think this kind of is a little bit stark too. So those who leave with university entrance, you can see that it is areas of Auckland where people are more likely to be lower socioeconomic, where people are more likely to leave without university entrance. Okay, work and incomes. So this is just all negative, which probably isn't a surprise. Certain politicians would go, it's the economy, stupid, but it's not just the economy, it's about a whole bunch of other things as well. But obviously employment has stalled or gone backwards, unemployment's risen, and wages and incomes are struggling to keep pace with inflation. And the need for welfare and hardship assistance is going up. This one's kind of interesting. So it's household debt. The graph looks at the total of all household debt held by New Zealanders as a percentage of the total income of all households. So the green line shows the proportion of this total income that is spent on debt servicing, and you can see that it's still rising even though interest rates have been falling. So borrowing has declined, but the cost of servicing of the debt has more than doubled as a proportion of income, from a low of like 5% in 2021 to over 10% in mid-2024. And so low-income households are more impacted by this because they've got less room to move in their budgets compared to those with higher incomes. And KiwiSaver hardship withdrawals have increased sharply in the last year, and the amount of money people are taking out of KiwiSaver has also increased sharply because people can't service their debts. Certain groupings of people are more likely to not be in employment training than others. But the message from this graph, which is why we put it in, is this really impacts the future. If people leave school without qualifications and then they are not going into further education, employment or some kind of training, then the chances of them having a poor outcome in the future are very, very high. So crime and punishment. So this is really our justice and prison system. And overall crime, no real change. Violent crime has got worse. Family violence, there was a slight improvement. However, I've got the recent stats and that's kind of dropped back again. Sentencing and imprisonment issues have got worse, and recidivism, so that's people continuing to offend, has also got worse.
What do you mean by sentence and imprisonment issues?
How many people are being sentenced and imprisoned in the justice system? Yeah, imprisonment rate. Yeah. So family violence, there was a little bit of a dip, but when we first published it, but we've recently got the last year's figures and you can see it's going back up again. The little bit of a dip we felt was, one positive piece of good news, and did show that a lot of programs that have been put in the last few years to try and educate people about family violence might have had an impact. But I think what you're seeing with the rise is what happens when we're in a very economically stressed situation, and the stress on families, which does unfortunately come out in violence. Prison population. So the number of people in prison has continued to increase across 2024-25, reaching nearly 10,000, which is a more than 2,000 increase on the mid-22 numbers. And the growth has been both in sentenced prisoners, so that's people who've been to court, been found guilty, they've been given a sentence of imprisonment, and those being remanded in prison. And so around 43% of people who are in prison are remanded in prison. Our prison system was never, ever, ever designed to have 43% of people in there being on remand. And one of the consequences of that is that we have a lot of people going to prison and sitting there and nothing is happening with them, because remand prisoners have not traditionally been able to access any programs. And you can sit in prison for 18 months waiting for your trial. And as some of you know, my husband works in prison. And so people who maybe got a conviction, which is a 2-year sentence, by the time they've got there, they'll be released on time served, and they'll have had no input whatsoever. And when you leave prison, you get $300 and you're out the gate. And then we wonder why we have a really high recidivism rate, because nothing happens. This government has said they want to remand people in prison more and they want to put in programs for people who are on remand. The question is how they're going to do that, because the prisons are already struggling from a staffing perspective. A prison officer can earn a quarter to half as much again if they go and work in a prison in Australia than living here. So staffing is really difficult. And also, the more people you have in prison, the harder it is to work with people. They're having to go to double bunking, which, 2 prisoners in a cell, very less than ideal. That is when you get violence and all sorts of stuff happening. So the theory might sound good. It actually isn't good even in theory, but it might sound good. But actually, practically, they've got no way of doing it right now. So you've just got more people going to prison, sitting there, waiting for their case to be heard, and the chances are they will get little to no rehabilitation services while they're in prison. Social hazards, we look at this because the Salvation Army is very concerned about alcohol harm and drug harm and gambling harm, and has been since its inception involved in helping people overcome addictions. So 4 indicators for this: 1, no change, and 3 have got worse. And the no change one doesn't mean it's good, it just means it hasn't got worse. So social hazard drug use. So here's the data on drugs. I'm sure we've all heard about methamphetamine, and you can see, the huge spike in methamphetamine. One of the reasons is we're a really good market for meth. We pay much more for our meth here, and the cartels like to get meth in here because they get much more money for it, even though we're a long way away and it takes them a bit more effort to get here. When they get it here, they'll get a really high price. So the total estimated economic harm from drug use is $2.1 billion a year. So that's what it costs us to deal with the harm from drugs. But that is nothing compared to alcohol. Alcohol is still the problem. That might look like the problem, but it's really only a small bit of the problem. Alcohol is still the problem. The Bridge Addiction Services that Sally's run see about 4,000 to 5,000 people a year, and alcohol is the primary thing. It's alcohol, meth, and cannabis in that order, in terms of what people are using and in what quantities. And the harm caused by alcohol costs us $9.1 billion a year. 9.1 billion in the cost of dealing with the harm of alcohol. And that's the justice system, the health system, Oranga Tamariki, police, all that. It's 9.1 billion. And so I like to go, imagine how many hospitals, doctors, houses, schools, teachers we could have if we weren't spending about 11.2 billion on drugs, and particularly on alcohol. And yet recently, the reform of the Sale of Liquor Act, which started out being about reducing alcohol harm, has all of a sudden become about making red tape less for the alcohol industry. I think, again, this is a figure which we should all be outraged at, and be going, I want my 9.1 billion back, please, from whoever's promoting harmful drinking here. Unfortunately, the way alcohol...
Colin, could you turn the heater off?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it clear over this? Do we know?
You're frying over there. So unfortunately, one of the problems we have in New Zealand with alcohol is the way it's distributed, which is the use of off licences. So, basically small liquor stores where people buy their alcohol. They're most densely found in our most vulnerable communities. We did a little survey at work the other day, which we videoed, and we went round and we said to people, because a lot of our staff in Manukau actually live in these deprived neighbourhoods, as well as where our clients come from. But not all of us. Some of us live in posh neighbourhoods. And so we went around and interviewed anyone and said, on your way to work this morning, how many off licences did you drive past? And everyone in Mangere and Otara and Manurewa was 5, 6, 7. Me, I was like, well, I know there is one, but I can't actually see it from the street when I drive to work. And people in the posher suburbs either didn't have one or didn't know where it was, or it was only one, but everyone in the other ones, yeah, they drove past 5, 6, 7 of them. An example of how this harms communities is in Rotorua, for example, 60% of off licences are in suburbs that are in the highest deprivation ranking. So consequently, even though those suburbs only represent 11% of Rotorua's population, they make up 1/3 of hospital admissions attributable to alcohol, and the highest proportion of police call-outs attributed to alcohol. So, it damages these very vulnerable communities. And I just want to add something now, and then I'll stop soon. Because you may not have, this is something I think we all need to be aware of, which is the intersection of buy now, pay later and alcohol harm. So you may not have heard of buy now, pay later, but basically these are apps on your phone that enable you to buy things and then pay for it over time. In my day, it used to be, lay-by and you didn't actually get the product, but now you get the product and then you pay for it later. Now, it is a way for people on low incomes to buy things that are expensive, and so when people are using it for things like buying a bed or buying a TV or whatever it might be, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But you can also use it for anything. So a lot of low-income households are now using it to buy food, and you can use it to buy alcohol. And so our financial mentors are seeing people coming in with debt because they're using buy now, pay later to buy food or to buy alcohol. There's only a few outlets, physical outlets, that allow you to use it, but all the supermarkets do. And online and liquor outlets allow you to use buy now, pay later to buy your alcohol. So you're getting to the situation where you don't have to leave home and you don't need to have the money, but you can have the alcohol delivered to your door at any hour of the day or night. And then pokie machines. I grew up in you absolutely don't gamble Presbyterian household. We couldn't even take a raffle ticket. I was quite relieved at that, because when the school was handing out raffle tickets for us to sell, I had to go, oh, my father won't let me. But did buy a raffle ticket once to get a doll's house, and I said to my mother, what happens if we win? And she said, we'll deal with that if it happens. But anyway, pokie machines are known to be the most addictive form of gambling that exists, because it's the instant gratification when you win. It's just instant. Plus the lights, everything. They've done studies. It is the most easily to get addicted to form of gambling. There has been a sinking lid on pokie machines, so the numbers are declining, but they're still basically all in our most deprived neighbourhoods. So the communities that have got the least money and that can least afford to lose money is where all the pokie machines are. And even though the numbers of machines are declining, the profit per machine is going up and up. So they're taking fewer machines, but they're taking more money. And people lost more than $1 billion last year on pokie machines. So just looking at Auckland again, you can see, again, the predominance of machines in our poorer neighbourhoods. The Salvation Army has been, so the pokie machine people often try and justify it by saying, oh, we give back to the community because we have these trusts and we give out money to community organisations and etc. But that money doesn't necessarily go back to the communities that lost it in the first place. So we've been advocating for a law that says the money has to go back to the community from which it was taken. We haven't won that one, obviously, but we think at the very least that should happen. And then finally, you'll be happy to tell, we are trying to look at Māori specifically and a Māori lens over things. And so we use a framework to look at Māori wellbeing, which is one that's been well researched and is actually used by Treasury. So, and we're trying to look at both the outcome and also the equity, and in this framework, equity is where Māori will achieve at the same level as anybody else. And this year we could only find improved outcomes in a handful of places, and improvements in equity were also pretty few and far between. But one of the good ones, and it's a good one for almost everyone, is, as I said, participation in early childhood. It's increasing for Māori, and I think this shows the impact of Kaupapa Māori early childhood centres and the work that they've done on encouraging Māori to enrol their kids in early childhood. And we know that early childhood education is absolutely vital for school success. So it's one piece of good news. However, things that really concern us is particularly around the fact that people are feeling that it's harder for them to express their identity. So a survey that was run looked at how Māori felt about, could they express their identity as Māori, and that is declining in the last year. And that's not surprising given the Treaty Principles Bill, a whole lot of things where Māori are just feeling that it's actually less safe, less viable for them to actually express their identity as Māori. So, we are known in the Salvation Army as the Doom and Gloom unit. And these stats are pretty sobering and, can be quite depressing. So the question I'm often asked is there hope? Is there hope? And I do like to say, well, the Salvation Army is founded on hope. So yes, we do believe there is hope. But part of getting to hope is actually coming to terms with the reality of what we're dealing with and the grim reality of what we're dealing with in many of our communities. And it's important to face up to these statistics, because if we don't, then we don't have a chance to actually think about how do we actually turn these things around. And one of the things I like to remind people at the end is to remember these are stats, but behind every stat are people. They're children, they're parents, they're people who are suffering because as a society we are not meeting everybody's basic needs. So it's important to know the stats, but also important to remember that these are real people, and we see them in our social services every day who are taking the impact of what's happening in our community. So in terms of hope, I think change is possible, and we do see that in the stats. It's fledgling, it's small, it's fragile at times, but change is possible. We do see that with the right combination of working at an individual, a whānau, a community, and a government level, we can actually make change. We can get upticks in those graphs. But we need that to be done consistently. It needs the right policies, and it needs a society and a political will that this is actually what we want to do. And finally, the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit is 21 years old this year. I was actually there at the beginning, so makes me feel a little ancient. And to celebrate that, we asked a range of people who've been working with us or for us down through the years to write some reflections, and you can find those on our website. And I think in there is, a bit of hope. And so I encourage you to read them. They're stories of hope and also stories of challenge for what we could achieve in New Zealand to make it a place of justice and where nobody gets left behind. So thank you very much. if you're a techie, you can scan that and that'll take you straight to the report. Got time for a few questions, a bit of discussion, as I say.
Yes.
I'm not a statistician or an economist, so if you want to get really numeric, I'll take a note and get back to you, but I may be able to answer some or have a discussion about anything.
I actually want to know, because you actually present all of these things to government, and so, I mean, you make it very easy for us to see that what's alarming, in our country. And so what happens when you speak to people and give them, I mean, these are quite easy statistics to understand, what do they do? What do the parliamentarians do about what you are presenting to them every year?
So I guess, how do I answer that? If you talk to the Prime Minister or any of the ministers, they would say that they understand all these stats, they understand that people are suffering, they understand that it's tough out there, and that everything they're doing is to try and turn that around. And I haven't met many politicians who don't actually genuinely care, like, we're thankfully not the United States. So most of our politicians do genuinely care, but it's just the way they think you can go about it, and who is taking the pain while things turn around. And we have some disagreement. We have some disagreement on that. But they would genuinely say, yes, we know, we agree it's really tough, but this is why we're focusing on growth, and this is why we're focusing on the economy, because a rising tide will lift all boats. I kind of want to say to them, yeah, but some of the people we're working with, they don't have a boat. They're lucky if they've got a twig, and if you do a rising tide, it's just going to drown them faster, because you need some other policies. So it's really a disagreement about what do we do, rather than this is the situation, which is actually, it might not sound positive, but it's actually positive, because a number of years ago, we'd have been debating whether this was true. Now we're not debating that it's true, but we are debating what we do about it. Yeah.
So what's the coalition government's solution to the housing issue?
Well, they won the market, obviously. Two, they want community housing groups to build more, which is good, but the number they're offering the community to build is not the same as the number that Kāinga Ora would have built. So they're really sort of pitching it on the private market to, come in and meet that need. Again, we get the economy right, we get growth going, people will build houses to rent, and that will solve the issue.
We're going to take away the red tape so people can buy
Yeah.
cheaper materials
Yeah.
from places that
Yeah.
can come down
Yeah.
the quality.
So that's basically their answer for everything at the moment is, we get the economy right, we get growth happening, everything else can drop out of that.
One thing I've noticed is that I live in Royal Oak, and there's a huge amount of housing going in.
Yeah.
And I've watched with interest is that some places that are brand new are sitting there empty. Are people building in the right areas for the right people?
Well, it's a big question. Depends whether it's social housing or private housing. So,
I think it was probably private, and I think it was so costed that it is out of reach of many people.
yeah.
Places that were for sale are now for rent. I watch all of this with great interest and think, well, these places are not suitable for families. Where can the little ones play? Where can the children play safely? There is nowhere.
So the private market, the problem with the private market is if you're a business person and you're putting your capital at risk, you want to get the maximum return. there's no, you know, there's very Simplicity Housing. So you might have seen Simplicity Housing around. Yep. They're one of the few people that are building to rent. And building to rent affordably. You know, the market for years has incentivised building really big, very expensive houses, because that's how you maximise, you know, your profit. There hasn't been an incentive to build to rent and to build to rent affordably. I mean, there's lots of places in the world where renting is actually, as you know, standard. But you can get a like a 90-year lease, so it's effectively like owning your own home, and you've got the right to decorate, and you've got the right to have a pet, and you've got, you know, all sorts of things. We've had a very a rental market that has largely been small providers. You know, mum and dad who've got 3 houses that they rent out, not well run. Relying on capital gains, highly geared, you know, not seeing being a rental provider as that's their business, you know, and you run it like a business. So that's long been a problem that we've got. So Simplicity, and there's a couple of other people who've entered the build to rent market, is actually good because it's going to raise the standard for people, and they're building affordably. But, you know, they're actually building a lot right now in Auckland, but it's not enough, you know, we need a whole lot more. So.
How active is the Salvation Army and other church groups in lobbying right throughout the year, rather than having big meetings that you mentioned, you know, with the Prime Minister? So what sort of numbers are involved in regular lobbying?
Well, there's lots of lobbying by everyone, so including people we wouldn't agree with. So last I was on the yeah. So yeah, we would. Well, I met with an MP today, so we'd be regularly meeting with MPs throughout the year from all shades of the political spectrum, trying to put through what's happening on the ground, what we think needs to happen, and there's lots of other groups, you know, doing that as well. But there's also, you know, like the alcohol thing's an interesting one. So I was on the media last week about what was happening with the Sale of Liquor Act, and you know, I had to carefully answer this, but I kept being asked, you know, do you think it's the alcohol industry have got to the minister? And I had to say, well, it's a democracy. They're perfectly entitled to talk to the minister as well, and they're very well resourced to do so. So there's plenty of lobbying going on. I think, you know, I think one of the problems is that we need a real seismic shift in thinking about our economy, you know, the kind of social contract that we have. We're lobbying people from pretty much Labor, National. They kind of think the same. It's just degrees of it. Whereas really what a lot of the economic commentators who are saying is we actually need a seismic shift in our thinking about what the economy is, who it's for, how it can operate. And until we get some of that, we're just going to get tinkering around the edges. But the problem is the current way of thinking in politics has been there for about 30 plus years. So you've got whole generations of politicians and officials in government who don't remember anything else. They only know this way of operating, and that makes it difficult to get anything that's outside the box tends to just get pushed to the side. So I think we've got to demand better thinking from our politicians. And also call them out on stuff, because what happens now is people promise stuff that absolutely cannot be done, you know, good or bad, you know, and we just let them get away with saying that. We don't go, hang on a minute, how are you actually going to deliver that? Or what does that mean? Well, what will that mean for these people? So I think we've got to make them a bit more accountable as, you know, participants in democracy. You know.
Bonnie, you say shameful statistics on the pokies.
Yeah.
Is any research done on the different payment options you've got available now to play pokies, which I understand, you know, use cards and
Yeah.
compared to it's like a penny in a slot and pull that out.
Yeah.
And online gambling.
Yeah. There is some, I haven't got the data in my head, but we are doing some work on online gambling because it's certainly increasingly a problem, as is, it's like alcohol. The stats with alcohol are really, really clear. If you want to reduce alcohol harm, you reduce availability. And the recent change that's been walked back from was reducing opening hours for off licences from 7 in the morning, currently it's 7 in the morning till 10 at night, was to reduce it to 9 in the morning to 9 at night, and the government's walking away from that. I'm like, it's still 12 hours a day you can buy alcohol, you know. And it's the same with gambling. If you reduce the availability and make it harder for, you know, people have to do a bit more effort to do it, then you do.
Make sure that they pay the minimum amount of taxes, and also, you know, that the CEOs are being paid enormous amounts, like it's way out here, hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. But also, and you know, and meanwhile they're losing complete understanding of what it is to be poor. But and so, you know, even as us, all of us, so here, you know, we grew up in a much more equal sort of like, there wasn't this enormous huge gap. But also the whole tax system needs to be, and also capital gains seems to be the way that a lot of people have made an enormous amount of money, and also that it's charging enormous amounts of rent to these very poor people. You know, why haven't we, why isn't it, it doesn't seem that people have an understanding of, you know, how our government works and how this can help. You know, like you've given us very clear statistics, but, you know, why isn't it that, you know, we aren't out there saying this has to change, you know, like, it just seems that we're sort of all sitting looking after ourselves, you know. It just is incredibly difficult, and it's why, you know, like, why can't we bring in this much better tax system, which would help, and so it would help our health system, our education, our everything. You know, it just seems incredible that we're allowing this to go on and on and on, and you know, you're watching. I mean, it must be very depressing for you to have watched this, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, people said that to me when I came back into the role. They said, isn't it a bit depressing that it's all the same stuff you were doing 21 years ago? And I go, well, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, there are a few things that have changed for the better. So you kind of hold on to that. But also, I go, who am I to give up? You know, because I'm a privileged person. You know, I grew up in a great family. You know, I've been employed. I've got a house. I'm a privileged person. So who am I to give up? You know, and so we need to keep going until we don't have these issues. And I won't see some of it in my lifetime. But who am I to give up? But to do your tax thing, I'm not a tax expert. I would recommend Tax Justice Aotearoa to you if you haven't heard of Tax Justice Aotearoa. They are, and we work with them, so we don't really get into the tax issue in our unit, but we work with Tax Justice Aotearoa and promote their material, and they're looking at various ways of changing the tax system so that it is more just, and that those who have the most, you know, pay the most, and those who have the least don't. But I think one of the reasons we haven't had any change is, you know, political, you know, politicians want to get elected, fundamentally. That's their primary thing. And so, you know, they're taking the pulse and they're going, if I bring in that kind of tax, I'm not going to get elected or I'm going to get kicked out. So again, I think, you know, democracy depends on us actually actively participating. And I think particularly those of us who are privileged, we have an even more responsibility to be sending messages to our local MP or whoever it might be about what we want to see and what we'd be prepared to do. But I also think it goes back to, we've got to change the narrative, because at the moment the narrative is You know, Labor want to take all your money and spend it on things that you don't want. You know, whereas National will give you the money and then you can spend it, you know, how you think.
Because it's your choice.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can drink and smoke.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a false dichotomy that they've set up, because that's not actually how it needs to operate. So we actually need the narrative to change and say, no, this isn't actually about who's paying what as much. It's actually about who are we as people of New Zealand, what do we want our society to be like, and therefore, what do we have to do in order for that to happen? But we're not having that conversation. We're just having this kind of money conversation up here where it's like, you know, if you're on this side of the political spectrum, you're going to automatically want this, and if you're on this side, you're going to want this. But actually, I think the conversation is, you know, what do we want our society to be like? And if that's what I really want, and I want it to look like this, and I want it to be based on these kind of values and this kind of social contract, okay, then what do I need to do in terms of a tax system that will support that? I mean, everyone wants to look at Scandinavia, and of course we don't have oil, but I think the difference there is people are happy to pay really high tax because they like what it gives them. It gives them a cohesive society. You know, I remember reading a writer who writes in the Listener. I've forgotten her name for the moment, and she had come back to New Zealand and was at a dinner party with some quite wealthy people who were, you know, slagging off about tax, and she just announced, "I like paying tax," and they looked at her, and she went, "I like what it gives me." And I think that's kind of the conversation we need to have, because it's all about who's paying what, and, you know, why should I pay more? I work hard and whatever. Instead of going, actually, what does tax give us? You know, what does it give us? It gives us the kind of society that we want. You know, are we getting that right now? I would hope no one would say, I want a society where I can afford several houses, but children go hungry tonight. You know, I don't think anyone really wants that. I just don't think they've joined the dots, or they don't want to join the dots. So we have to change the conversation. And I guess what I'd say to all of us here is we can be part of that. Like, you know, how often have you listened to someone kind of slag off people who are poor or are beneficiaries, or talk, you know, and you just let it go? You know, and I think we need to gently more hold each other up to account and hold the mirror up and go, hang on a minute, you know, have you thought about that? Or do you know anyone who's trying to raise a child on their own? Or, you know, because there's a lot of misinformation about how things are actually working out there and what the reality is. And we can all kind of help hold each other to account to actually be a bit more informed, I think. So.
Which, of course, is what we've been doing tonight.
Tonight, yes.
Informing ourselves. So can I say a huge thank you to Bonnie